Right now, the ATP Tour is breathing a silent sigh of relief because Carlos Alcaraz is sidelined with a severe wrist injury. But behind closed doors, tennis executives and his top rivals are absolutely terrified of what happens when he comes back at 100%. Because there is a secret, highly controversial rule change quietly being pushed for Grand Slams. And if it passes, a healthy Alcaraz won't just dominate tennis, he will completely break it. The sports power brokers are currently debating a structural overhaul that would alter the very DNA of how major tournaments are played and won, removing the traditional exhaustion safety net that the rest of the tour relies on to survive him. This is the hidden plan that has the entire tour on high alert, and it changes everything we know about the next 10 years of the sport. But as the tennis world hyper-focuses on the brutal ATP calendar and the mechanics of his right wrist, a much darker question is beginning to echo through the locker rooms. What if this injury didn't actually start on a tennis court? What if the catastrophic breakdown of his dominant hand wasn't just a streak of terrible luck, but the direct, predictable consequence of a young prodigy losing his discipline after completely destroying the internal foundation that kept him safe? For 7 years, Alcaraz operated under a regime of absolute uncompromising sobriety. But the moment his inner circle executed a shocking late-night ambush to push out the only man who could tell him no, the ultimate protection mechanism around Carlos vanished, leaving his body entirely exposed to a lethal cocktail of family ambition, commercial greed, and an internal panic that eventually pushed him over the edge. To understand the severe right wrist tenosynovitis that sidelined Carlos Alcaraz, you have to look past the surface-level diagnosis and enter the chaotic, high-stakes boardroom drama of his offseason. For 7 years, Alcaraz operated under a regime of absolute, uncompromising structural discipline enforced by Juan Carlos Ferrero. The former world number one did not just teach Carlos how to hit a tennis ball. He served as a human shield against distractions, fiercely enforcing a lifestyle of absolute focus and strict physical accountability. But in December 2025, that entire defensive foundation was violently upended. The tennis community was blindsided when Alcaraz announced the end of their historic 6 Grand Slam partnership. While the public statements were coded in corporate diplomacy, the underlying reality was an absolute administrative ambush. Behind the scenes, when it came time to renew Ferrero's contract, the Alcaraz camp made him wait 2 weeks for a proposal. When it finally arrived, it was a brutal, non-negotiable take-it-or-leave-it contract with a significant salary reduction, giving the Coach of the Year a mere 48 hours to sign. Ferrero refused, later admitting to the media that he deeply wished he could have continued, and that the sudden dismissal left him profoundly hurt. This contract ambush was heavily engineered by Carlos's father, who wanted to wrest control away from Ferrero's strict Vienna academy and shift training to the family's local base in Murcia. When Ferrero walked out the door, the intense daily psychological guardrails went with him. Samuel Lopez, a fantastic technician and Ferrero's former right-hand man, took over the head coaching duties for the 2026 season. But while Lopez possessed elite tactical knowledge, he inherently lacked the unique paternal authority Ferrero had spent nearly a decade establishing. The immediate fallout was a subtle but highly dangerous shift in Alcaraz's discipline. Reports surfaced that Ferrero had repeatedly clashed with the inner circle over Carlos playing lucrative, highly exhausting exhibition events during the crucial December rest periods, rather than focusing on biological recovery. Without Ferrero there to aggressively pull the emergency brake, Alcaraz went entirely too easy on his body's structural warning signs, indulging in highly publicized off-season trips to Ibiza, and taking his foot off the gas regarding the tedious, preventative rehabilitation work required to protect his violent mechanics. Had Ferrero still been occupying the player box, commanding total authority over the training schedules, The early signs of wrist stress would have been met with an immediate, mandatory shutdown. Instead, under a more relaxed, permissive environment, the minor inflammation was allowed to simmer completely unchecked. This internal discipline vacuum collided directly with a massive, invisible wall of commercial and parental pressure. Carlos is no longer just a free-spirited kid who loves playing tennis. He is the primary financial engine of a multi-million-dollar global corporate empire. The Alcaraz family isn't just managing an athlete. They were aggressively constructing a massive tennis academy legacy in Murcia, a venture that requires constant injection of global capital and non-stop public visibility. When an entire family's commercial future sits squarely on the tendons of a 22-year-old's right hand, taking a voluntary 3-month break to heal a minor ache becomes a financial impossibility. The corporate sponsors demand appearances, the tournaments demand star power, and the family enterprise demands constant forward momentum. Carlos was trapped in a system where resting was subconsciously framed as a failure to deliver on his obligations to the people he loved most. But the final devastating ingredient in this injury cocktail was the internal dictator living inside Alcaraz's own mind. Even as his physical discipline slipped in his daily routine, his competitive obsession remained entirely fanatical. Throughout the early months of 2026, Carlos was forced to sit in locker rooms and watch Jannik Sinner execute a flawless, robotic assault on the ATP Tour, capturing consecutive Masters titles and building an immense lead at the top of the sport. The sight of his chief rival running away with the era triggered an intense internal panic. Desperate to catch up, yet lacking the rigid, calming guidance of Ferrero to manage his workload, Alcaraz began throwing raw, chaotic effort at the ball. He attempted to overcompensate for his lack of structured preparation by pushing his body far past its biological thresholds within the brutal, unforgiving parameters of the ATP Tour schedule. The modern tennis calendar is a relentless 11-month meat grinder that systematically destroys human joints. But when you mix that structural overload with a compromised training regime, immense family expectations, and an obsessive need to hunt down world number one, a catastrophic physical breakdown is the only logical result. The fluid in his right wrist tendon sheath didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was actively forced into existence by a young superstar who tore down his own protective walls, allowed the outside world to dictate his pace, and ultimately ran himself straight into a medical disaster. The Alcaraz clan is no longer just a family living in El Palmar. They are the board of directors for a hyper-lucrative global corporate entity. When Carlos hits a tennis ball, he isn't just competing for a trophy, he is generating the raw capital required to fund a sprawling, multi-million-dollar real estate and sporting legacy. At the center of this commercial vortex is Carlos Alcaraz Sr., a man whose ambitions for his son stretch far beyond the baseline. The sudden, calculated ousting of Juan Carlos Ferrero was the opening salvo in a massive structural takeover. For years, Ferrero insisted that Carlos remain insulated within the quiet, monastic walls of the Equalite Academy in Vienna, away from the local distractions of Murcia. But the family had a different blueprint: the construction of the massive Alcaraz Tennis Academy in their home province, a crown jewel project designed to cement the family name into the bedrock of Spanish sports history. To fund an empire of that scale, the corporate machine can never stop running. This is where the silent, devastating pressure of the golden goose syndrome begins to crush a young athlete. Unlike the Big Three, who built their financial empires over decades of sustained dominance, Alcaraz was handed the keys to the sport's commercial future at age 19. He is locked into astronomical, long-term endorsement contracts with Nike, Rolex, BMW, and Babolat. Deals that do not just pay for his performance on court, but actively demand his physical presence at high-profile marketing activations, global photo shoots, and lucrative off-season exhibition matches. When Ferrero was in charge, he acted as a fierce, uncompromising firewall, routinely telling multi-million-dollar sponsors and powerful tournament directors no to protect his players' baseline recovery windows. But when the family took absolute control of the calendar, that firewall evaporated. The lifestyle shift was immediate and visible. Instead of an uninterrupted, rigorous 5-week winter training block dedicated to core stability and injury prevention, Alcaraz's late 2025 offseason became a whirlwind of commercial obligations. He was flown across continents to play high-paying exhibitions in Saudi Arabia and South America, transforming his supposed rest period into a secondary competitive season. To the family administration, these appearances were essential for building the global brand and funding the upcoming Murcia Academy. To a 22-year-old body, however, it was an absolute biological tax. Carlos was trapped in a gilded cage of his own success, operating under the subconscious heavy burden that stepping off the tour for an extended block would directly stall the momentum of his family's grand enterprise. This financial overload creates a profound psychological paradox that casual fans never see on the television broadcast. A player like Alcaraz is hyper-aware that his entire circle, his parents, his siblings, his childhood friends, and an entire network of employees, relies entirely on the structural integrity of his right arm. It is an immense, almost suffocating amount of adult responsibility to place on the shoulders of a young man. Every time his body flashes a warning sign, every time a dull ache begins to throb in his forearm tendons, the decision to pull out of a tournament is no longer just a medical choice. It is weighed against missed guarantees, disappointed sponsors, and the cooling of the corporate engine that powers his family's dream. The modern tennis ecosystem is brutal enough on its own, but when parental ambition merges with corporate management, the athlete loses their autonomy. Carlos was effectively conditioned to believe that his value was directly tied to his constant velocity. The family machine treated his hyper-athletic body as an infinite resource that can simply be patched up between flights. Without a detached, objective third party like Ferrero to look at the family board and demand a total operational shutdown, Carlos kept pushing, kept smiling for the cameras, and kept stepping out onto the court while carrying micro-tears in his wrist. He was running on a treadmill engineered by the people he loved most, a relentless pace where taking a voluntary tournament break was framed not as a necessity, but as a luxury they simply couldn't afford. And eventually, the biology of a human tendon did what the Alcaraz family refused to do. It forced the entire multi-million-dollar empire to a grinding, agonizing halt. The most dangerous pressure cooker in professional sports isn't constructed by global sportswear brands or ambitious fathers. It is forged entirely inside the mind of a generational prodigy, watching his lifelong rival run away with history. While the boardroom machinations of the Alcaraz family and the grueling travel demands of the ATP Tour set the stage for a physical breakdown, it was Carlos's own fanatical, obsessive drive that ultimately pulled the trigger. To truly understand why his right wrist tendon sheath physically collapsed under the load, you have to look past the external noise and enter the deeply wounded psychology of a champion who suddenly realized he was losing his grip on the era. The entire early portion of the 2026 season functioned as an absolute psychological horror show for Carlos Alcaraz. Just months prior, he had scaled the absolute mountain, defeating Jannik Sinner in a breathtaking, historic Australian Open final to capture his 7th Grand Slam title and complete the elusive career Grand Slam at just 22 years old. He left Melbourne as the undisputed king of the sport, holding down the world #1 ranking and seemingly destined to dominate the next decade of men's tennis, entirely unopposed. But the modern tennis landscape shifts with a terrifying, whiplash-inducing velocity. Almost overnight, the narrative completely flipped. Instead of an uninterrupted Alcaraz monarchy, the tennis world bore witness to a flawless, robotic, and utterly devastating counterassault by Jannik Sinner. The Italian did not just bounce back from his Melbourne defeat, he transformed into an unkillable baseline machine, executing a historic rampage across the spring calendar. Sinner tore through the draw in Indian Wells, weaponized his pristine ground strokes in Miami, and proceeded to sweep up the high-stakes clay court titles in Monte Carlo, Madrid, and Rome. 6 consecutive Masters 1000 trophies marched straight into Sinner's cabinet. By the time the tour arrived at the final of the Monte Carlo Masters in mid-April, Sinner did the unthinkable. He dismantled Alcaraz on the red clay, stripping the Spaniard of his world #1 ranking and establishing a near-insurmountable 4,000-point canyon at the apex of the leaderboard. For a hyper-competitive soul like Alcaraz, watching this corporate, unbothered dominance unfold from across the locker room was an utter psychological trauma. He wasn't just losing tennis matches. He was watching his chief rival systematically erase his legacy in real time. The sports media, which had spent the last 2 years crowning Alcaraz as the definitive heir to the Big Three, instantly shifted its allegiance, aggressively painting Sinner as the true, cold-blooded ruler of the new era. Every single day, Alcaraz was confronted with broadcast graphics detailing Sinner's flawless efficiency, his historic financial earnings per minute on court, and his unbothered march toward tennis immortality. This is the exact moment where the lack of an authoritative, stabilizing mentor like Juan Carlos Ferrero proved to be utterly fatal. When an elite athlete panics, their primitive instinct is always to overcompensate through sheer brute force. They assume that if they are losing ground, the only solution is to work harder, hit faster, and push their anatomy to more extreme thresholds. Had Ferrero still been occupying the head coaching seat, he would have recognized this toxic mental loop instantly. Ferrero, who lived through the brutal baseline wars of the early 2000s, would have stepped into the training room, grabbed Carlos by the shoulders, and forced him to accept a patient, macro-strategic blueprint. He would have explained that Sinner was riding an unsustainable wave of peak form, and that rushing to match his intensity would only result in physical self-destruction. But with Samuel Lopez operating under a more relaxed, permissive coaching framework, there was no one left in the inner circle with the raw patriarchal authority required to save Carlos from himself. Alcaraz became his own head coach, his own trainer, and his own internal dictator. Driven by an intense, fanatical need to hunt Sinner down and reclaim his crown on the Spanish clay of Barcelona, Carlos completely threw out the concept of micro-precise workload management. If Sinner was spending 4 hours a day on the practice court, Alcaraz would spend 5. If Sinner's forehand was crossing the net at 93 miles per hour, Alcaraz would deliberately alter his wrist snap to force his own forehand up to 98. He began throwing raw, chaotic, and completely undisciplined effort at the tennis ball during his private training blocks in Murcia. To compensate for a lack of structured technical preparation, he relied entirely on his explosive athleticism, hitting every single baseline stroke with a violent, frantic intent that his underlying joints simply weren't prepared to absorb. The human wrist is an incredibly intricate piece of biological engineering, a delicate network of small bones and slender tendons designed for precision, not to act as a shock absorber for a human being trying to outmuscle a machine. When you combine Alcaraz's naturally violent, extreme wrist lag technique with a state of hyperventilating competitive panic, you are no longer playing tennis, you are playing Russian roulette with your own anatomy. The physical breaking point arrived in the opening round of the Barcelona Open against Finland's Otto Virtanen. To the casual spectator watching the broadcast, Alcaraz's 6-4, 6-2 victory looked like routine baseline execution. But if you watch the tape with an analytical eye, the tragedy is written in his body language. Desperate to protect his home court and stop the bleeding on the leaderboard, Carlos was swinging through a dull, throbbing ache that had been building in his right hand for weeks. His internal dictator refused to let him stop. He swallowed the pain, masked the inflammation with immediate medical tape, and forced his forearm muscles to violently contract microsecond after microsecond, driving the protective fluid sheath surrounding his crucial tendons past its absolute elasticity threshold. By the time he walked off the court and entered the diagnostic tent, the damage was completely done. The medical scans revealed a severe, advanced case of tenosynovitis, the definitive biological protest of a body that had been pushed too hard, too fast, by a young man who refused to lose. The tour thinks bad luck or a brutal schedule sidelined Carlos Alcaraz this summer. In reality, he was run off the road by the terrifying ghost of his own ambition. He was trapped in a self-imposed prison of perfection, a psychological echo chamber where the fear of being left behind by Jannik Sinner completely blinded him to the structural limits of his own mortality. The empty player box at Wimbledon stands as a haunting monument to the cost of unchecked ambition. This entire summer collapse was not a random stroke of bad luck, nor was it a simple mechanical failure that could be fixed with a few weeks of physical therapy. It was the predictable, devastating consequence of a young prodigy caught in the ultimate crossfire of modern sports. A brutal collision between an ambitious family empire, an unsustainable global tennis calendar, and a fanatical internal dictator that refused to ever let him look vulnerable. But as the tennis world moves on, aggressively hyper-focusing on the robotic dominance of Jannik Sinner on the grass courts of London, a strange and powerful transformation is quietly taking place inside that private rehabilitation clinic in Murcia. For the first time since he was a teenage prodigy bursting onto the global stage, Carlos Alcaraz has been completely stripped of his ability to compete. The computer spreadsheet that tracks his freefall on the leaderboard is no longer a source of daily panic. It has become his ultimate psychological liberation. By forcing a total operational shutdown, this severe wrist tenosynovitis has effectively shattered the mirror of perfection Carlos was trying so desperately to maintain. Isolated from the non-stop travel demands of the tour and removed from the immediate financial pressures of his family's upcoming academy timeline, Alcaraz is finally being granted the one luxury the tennis machine always denied him: time to grow up. He is no longer running on a treadmill engineered by the expectations of the outside world. The footage leaking out of his private training base shows a completely different kind of athlete emerging from the shadows. His right arm remains heavily protected, but his lower body has been completely re-engineered. He is attacking the gym with a disciplined, mature focus, building an underlying physical armor that will structurally protect his hyper-aggressive mechanics for the next 10 years. More importantly, he is learning the brutal, essential art of independent ownership. When Carlos Alcaraz finally steps back onto the high-stakes hard courts of the North American swing this August, the rest of the locker room will not be facing the compromised, panicked kid who broke his body trying to chase down a ranking number. They will be facing a deeply rested, hyper-conditioned titan who has looked into the abyss of his own career mortality and refused to blink. The dropped ranking points and the missed Grand Slam trophies are a cheap price to pay for a generational genius who has finally discovered his own limits. The tour thought this injury layout saved them from his dominance, but it actually just eliminated his final structural weakness. And when he walks out onto Arthur Ashe Stadium, fully healed and completely independent, the rest of the world will realize that the king didn't lose his crown. He was just waiting for the pretenders to exhaust themselves before he came back to claim it.